The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Martina's gun shop, casting long shadows across rows of firearms that gleamed like sleeping steel serpents. Sarah Chen moved between them with practiced grace, her cloth working in steady circles across the barrel of a vintage Winchester rifle. At 28, she had spent the last decade of her life surrounded by these instruments of precision, yet she had never fired a single shot in anger, never felt the weight of taking a life. Her grandfather's shop had been her sanctuary since she was 18, fleeing from a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. The death of her parents in a car accident had left her adrift, bouncing between foster homes where she learned that trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. When old Martinez took her in, not as a daughter but as an apprentice, she found something she had never known before: purpose. The bell above the door chimed softly, and Sarah looked up from her work. A man entered, moving with the controlled precision of someone who had spent years learning to walk silently. He was tall, perhaps 35, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of time spent in harsh places under unforgiving skies. His eyes swept the shop with professional assessment before settling on her. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that suggested too many nights sleeping in the cold. "I'm looking for someone who understands precision rifles." Sarah set down the Winchester carefully, wiping her hands on the leather apron that had belonged to Martinez before his death 2 years ago. "That would be me," she said, studying the stranger. There was something about the way he held himself, a coiled readiness that reminded her of the combat veterans who sometimes visited the shop. "What exactly are you looking for?" The man approached the counter, his movements deliberate and economical. "Jake Morrison," he said, extending a calloused hand. "I need something custom. Long range. Very long range." Sarah shook his hand, noting the firm grip and the small scars that marked his knuckles. "Sarah Chen. How long range are we talking about?" Jake's lips curved into what might have been a smile. "Let's just say farther than most people think is possible." Something in his tone made Sarah pause in her automatic response about the shop's inventory. She had learned to read people during her years here, to distinguish between the weekend warriors who wanted to feel dangerous and the professionals who actually were. Jake Morrison fell into the latter category, but there was something else about him, something that made her pulse quicken in a way she didn't entirely understand. "Most of our precision rifles are good out to about 800 meters, she said, watching his reaction. "For anything beyond that, you're looking at custom work. Expensive custom work." "Money isn't the issue," Jake said simply. "Quality is. And I need to know that whoever builds it understands what they're creating." Sarah felt a familiar stirring, the same sensation she got when faced with a particularly challenging restoration project. "What's your background, Mr. Morrison? If you don't mind me asking." Jake was quiet for a moment, his eyes scanning the array of rifles behind her. "Military. Special operations. I've been shooting competitively since I got out, but I'm looking to push some boundaries." It was a careful answer, revealing just enough to establish credibility while giving away nothing substantial. Sarah recognized the technique because she used it herself whenever customers asked about her past. The difference was that Jake's secrets likely involved classified missions and life-or-death decisions, while hers were simply the accumulated pain of a young woman who had learned to guard her heart. "I can show you some options," she said, moving toward the locked cabinet where they kept the high-end precision rifles. "But first, I need to know what kind of shooting you're planning to do." Jake followed her, and she was acutely aware of his presence behind her as she worked the combination lock. "Competition," he said. "There's a specialized event coming up." "Very specialized." Sarah pulled out a Remington 700 in .338 Lapua Magnum, one of their finest pieces. The rifle was a work of art, its stock hand-carved from walnut and its barrel precision machined to tolerances measured in fractions of thousandths of an inch. "This is beautiful," she said, running her fingers along the smooth wood. "Effective range out to 1,500 meters with the right ammunition." Jake took the rifle, and Sarah watched his hands as he examined it. His touch was reverent, the way a musician might handle a rare violin. He shouldered the weapon smoothly, his cheek finding the stock with practiced ease, his eye aligning naturally with the scope. "Good balance," he said, lowering the rifle. "But I need something more specialized. Something that can reach out to 3,800 meters and still put a round where I want it." Sarah's breath caught. 3,800 meters was an extraordinary distance, far beyond what most shooters ever attempted. It was the realm of military snipers and the handful of civilians who had dedicated their lives to pushing the absolute limits of precision shooting. "That's a very long shot," she said carefully. "At that range, you're dealing with variables most people never consider. Wind patterns at different altitudes, the Coriolis effect, even the curvature of the Earth becomes a factor." Jake's eyes sharpened with interest. "You know about the Coriolis effect?" "Of course," Sarah said, feeling a flush of pride despite herself. "At extreme ranges, the Earth's rotation actually affects bullet trajectory. A right-hand drift that increases with distance and target bearing." For the first time since he'd entered the shop, Jake looked genuinely surprised. "Most gunsmiths I've met wouldn't know about that." "I'm not most gunsmiths," Sarah replied, then immediately regretted the defensive tone in her voice. Jake studied her for a long moment, and Sarah had the unsettling feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. "No," he said finally, "I don't think you are." The shop fell quiet except for the steady tick of the old clock on the wall and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Sarah found herself trapped in Jake's gaze, aware that something was shifting between them, some unspoken understanding taking shape. "Tell me about yourself, Sarah Chen," Jake said, setting the Remington carefully on the counter. "How does someone your age learn about extreme long-range ballistics?" Sarah felt her defenses rising automatically. She had perfected the art of deflecting personal questions, of revealing just enough to seem open while giving away nothing that mattered. But something about Jake made her want to answer honestly, and that frightened her more than any curiosity from a customer. "Books, mostly," she said, which was partially true. Martinez had an extensive library on ballistics and precision shooting. "I read everything I could get my hands on." "And practical experience?" Sarah hesitated. The truth was that she had never fired at distances beyond 600 meters, and even that had been at the shooting range with Martinez before his death. Her knowledge was theoretical, gained from countless hours studying ballistic tables and trajectory charts. But admitting that felt like confessing to fraud, like revealing that her expertise was built on sand. "Some," she said, which was not entirely a lie. "Enough to understand the challenges." Jake nodded slowly, as if he had heard something in her voice that she hadn't intended to reveal. "The reason I ask," he said, "is that what I'm proposing isn't just about building a rifle. It's about understanding the complete system. The weapon, the ammunition, the shooter, the environment. All working together." "I understand that," Sarah said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, laying it on the counter between them. It showed a target at what appeared to be an enormous distance, a small white square against a backdrop of rolling hills. "This was taken at 3,600 meters," he said. "The target is a 12-inch steel plate." Sarah picked up the photograph, studying it with growing amazement. At that distance, the target was barely visible, a tiny speck that would require not just an exceptional rifle and perfect ammunition, but shooting skills that bordered on the supernatural. "You hit this?" she asked. 3 out of 5 shots, Jake said matter-of-factly. But that was with a rifle that had been built specifically for that distance, by a gunsmith who understood exactly what was required. Sarah looked up from the photograph, meeting his eyes. "And you think I could build something like that?" "I think," Jake said carefully, "that you have more potential than you realize. But potential isn't enough. Not for what I have in mind." The bell above the door chimed again, and Sarah looked past Jake to see Mrs. Henderson entering with her late husband's hunting rifle. The elderly woman was a regular customer, bringing the old Marlin in for cleaning every few months, as much for the company as for the service. "I should take care of her," Sarah said, grateful for the interruption. The conversation with Jake had taken on an intensity that left her feeling exposed and uncertain. "Of course," Jake said, stepping aside. "But, Sarah?" She turned back to him, noting that he had used her first name with an easy familiarity that should have annoyed her but somehow didn't. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said. "And I'd like to continue our conversation." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady. She watched him leave, noting the way he moved with unconscious grace, the way his eyes swept the street before he stepped outside. Then, Mrs. Henderson was at the counter with her rifle and her stories about her late husband's hunting expeditions, and Sarah forced herself to focus on the familiar routine of customer service. But her mind kept drifting back to Jake Morrison and his talk of 3,800-meter shots. She thought about the photograph he had shown her, about the casual confidence with which he had discussed ballistics that existed at the very edge of what was possible. Most of all, she thought about the way he had looked at her, as if he had seen something she didn't know she possessed. After Mrs. Henderson left, Sarah locked the shop and made her way to the small apartment above it where she had lived since Martinez's death. The space was spartanly furnished, containing little beyond the basics of survival and an extensive library of technical manuals and ballistics texts. She had never felt the need for more personal touches, for the photographs and mementos that most people used to mark their territory as home. She made herself a simple dinner and settled into the worn leather chair that had been Martinez's favorite, opening a book on advanced ballistics that she had read dozens of times before. But the familiar equations and trajectory charts couldn't hold her attention. Instead, she found herself thinking about Jake's challenge, about rifles that could reach across nearly 4 kilometers of space to touch their targets with deadly precision. It was an absurd distance, she told herself. The kind of shooting that required not just exceptional equipment but years of experience reading wind and weather, understanding how heat waves and humidity could bend a bullet's path in ways that defied simple calculation. She had the theoretical knowledge, but theory and practice were entirely different things. Yet something deep inside her responded to the challenge, the same part of her that had driven her to master the intricate art of precision gunsmithing. She had always been drawn to problems that others considered impossible, to the satisfaction of achieving something that pushed the boundaries of what was thought possible. As she sat in the growing darkness, Sarah Chen found herself imagining what it would feel like to build a rifle capable of reaching across such an enormous distance. More than that, she found herself wondering what it would be like to pull the trigger on such a shot, to feel the weapon's recoil and, then, wait through the long seconds it would take for the bullet to reach its target nearly 4 kilometers away. For the first time in years, she felt something that might have been excitement stirring in her chest. And, for reasons she couldn't quite name, that excitement was inextricably linked to the quiet stranger who had walked into her shop that morning and looked at her as if he could see straight through to her soul. Outside her window, the city settled into its nightly rhythm of distant sirens and muffled conversation. But Sarah Chen sat in her chair long into the night, her mind filled with ballistic coefficients and wind drift calculations, with images of impossible shots and the man who claimed he could make them. Tomorrow, Jake Morrison would return. And, somehow, Sarah knew that when he did, her carefully ordered life would never be the same. Sarah had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw ballistic trajectories arcing across impossible distances, felt the weight of an unfired rifle in her hands, heard the echo of Jake Morrison's voice asking her about the Coriolis effect. She rose before dawn, moving through her morning routine with mechanical precision while her mind raced through calculations she had never needed to make in practice. The shop opened at 8, but Jake was waiting outside at 7:30, holding 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. He looked as if he had slept perfectly, which somehow irritated Sarah more than it should have. "Peace offering," he said, extending one of the cups as she unlocked the door. "I figured I might have overwhelmed you yesterday." Sarah accepted the coffee, noting that he had somehow guessed she preferred it black. "You didn't overwhelm me," she said, which was both true and completely false. "I just want to understand exactly what you're proposing." Jake followed her inside, watching as she went through the familiar ritual of opening the shop. She turned on the lights, checked the security system, and verified that everything was exactly as she had left it. It was a routine that usually calmed her, but today it felt like stalling. "Fair enough," Jake said, settling onto the stool in front of the counter. "What I'm proposing is a partnership. You build me a rifle capable of extreme long-range precision, and I teach you how to shoot it." Sarah paused in arranging the cleaning supplies she had been organizing the night before. "Why would you want to teach me?" "Because," Jake said, sipping his coffee, "building that rifle is only half the equation. The other half is understanding how it performs in actual use. And, from what I observed yesterday, you have the technical knowledge but not the practical experience." It was a tactful way of calling her out on her lack of field experience, and Sarah appreciated the diplomacy even as it stung. "And what makes you think I want to learn to shoot at that distance?" Jake was quiet for a moment, studying her face with those unsettling eyes. "Because when I mentioned 3,800 meters yesterday, you didn't say it was impossible. You said it was challenging. There's a difference." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. He was right, of course. The moment he had mentioned that distance, her mind had immediately begun working on the problem, calculating the variables and imagining solutions. It wasn't the impossibility that intrigued her, it was the challenge of making the impossible possible. Even if I wanted to learn, she said, where would we practice? Shots like that require enormous amounts of space. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I've been scouting locations. There's a private ranch about 3 hours from here, owned by a former military contractor. He's got a range that extends out to 4,000 meters, with all the equipment we'd need for wind measurement and target verification. Sarah unfolded the paper, revealing a detailed topographical map marked with elevation markers and wind direction indicators. The level of preparation was impressive and slightly unnerving. You've been planning this for a while. I've been planning this for 6 months, Jake admitted. I've visited 12 gun shops looking for the right combination of technical expertise and... He paused, searching for the right words. And what? Hunger, he said simply. Most gunsmiths are satisfied with good enough. They'll build you a rifle that shoots accurately at reasonable distances and call it a day. But what I need requires someone who won't be satisfied with good enough. Someone who needs to know if they can actually do it. Sarah set down the map, her hands trembling slightly. She had spent 10 years in this shop, building a reputation for quality work and attention to detail. She was respected in the small community of precision shooting enthusiasts, known for her meticulous craftsmanship and deep technical knowledge. But all of that had been achieved within safe boundaries, working on problems that were challenging but not impossible. What exactly are you asking me to do? She said. Jake leaned forward, his expression becoming serious. I'm asking you to build a rifle that can consistently hit targets at 3,800 meters. I'm asking you to learn to shoot it yourself. And then, I'm asking you to enter a competition that will test both the rifle and your skills against some of the best long-range shooters in the world. Sarah's breath caught. What kind of competition? It's called the Extreme Distance Challenge, Jake said. It's invitation only, held once a year at a private facility in Montana. 24 shooters, competing at distances from 2,000 to 4,000 meters. The entry fee is $25,000, and the prize for first place is $250,000. The numbers were staggering. Sarah had never imagined that such competitions existed, let alone that the stakes could be so high. And, you think I could compete in something like that? I think, Jake said carefully, that with the right training and the right equipment, you could win it. Sarah stared at him, searching his face for any sign that he was joking or testing her somehow. But his expression was completely serious, and she realized with a shock that he actually believed what he was saying. That's insane, she said finally. I've never shot competitively. I've never even shot at distances beyond 600 meters. Which means you don't have any bad habits to unlearn, Jake replied. You understand the theory better than most people who've been shooting for decades. What you need is practical application, and I can teach you that. Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the quiet street where people were beginning their normal Tuesday routines. A part of her envied them their predictable lives, their problems that could be solved with ordinary solutions. But a larger part of her was already imagining what it would feel like to take aim at a target nearly 4 kilometers away, to solve the countless variables that would determine whether her shot found its mark. Why me? She asked without turning around. You could find shooters with years of experience, people who already know how to handle shots at that distance. Because, Jake said, and she could hear him standing up, moving closer, experienced shooters already know what they can't do. They've internalized the limits, accepted them as facts. But you don't know those limits yet. And, sometimes, not knowing what's impossible is the only way to achieve it. Sarah turned back to face him, struck by the conviction in his voice. You really believe that? I know it, Jake said. I've seen it happen. The best snipers aren't always the ones with the most experience. They're the ones who refuse to accept that a shot can't be made. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The shop felt smaller somehow, charged with possibilities that Sarah had never allowed herself to consider. She thought about Martinez, about the way he had taken her in when no one else would give her a chance. He had seen something in her that she hadn't known existed, had taught her not just the technical aspects of gunsmithing but the deeper philosophy of precision work. Martinez used to say that every rifle has one perfect shot in it, she said quietly. One moment when everything aligns perfectly and the impossible becomes inevitable. Jake nodded slowly. He sounds like a wise man. He was. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling as if she stood at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss that might contain either destruction or transcendence. If I agreed to this, what would be the timeline? The competition is in 4 months, Jake said. That gives us time to design and build the rifle, work out the ballistics, and get you trained on the fundamentals of extreme long-range shooting. 4 months. Sarah repeated the words, trying to imagine compressing years of experience into such a short period. That's not very long. No, it's not, Jake agreed. Which is why we'd need to work together every day. I'd basically be moving here for the duration. Sarah felt her pulse quicken at the thought of spending that much time with Jake Morrison. There was something about him that made her feel simultaneously comfortable and completely off balance, as if he could see through the careful barriers she had built around herself. And if I said no? Jake shrugged. Then, I'd thank you for your time and find another gunsmith. But I don't think you're going to say no. Why not? Because you're already calculating powder charges and barrel twist rates in your head. Because when I mentioned the extreme distance challenge, your eyes lit up like Christmas morning. And because Martinez didn't spend 10 years training someone who was satisfied with ordinary achievements. Sarah laughed despite herself. You don't know anything about Martinez. I know he was smart enough to recognize talent when he saw it, Jake said. And I know he'd want you to find out what you're really capable of. The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. Martinez had always pushed her to take on more challenging projects, to experiment with techniques that other gunsmiths considered too risky or too time-consuming. He had believed in her potential even when she didn't believe in it herself. This is crazy, she said, but even as she spoke the words, she could feel her resistance crumbling. The best things usually are, Jake replied. Sarah looked around the shop, at the familiar tools and equipment that had been her world for so long. She thought about the routine she had built here, the safe predictability of problems she knew how to solve. Then, she thought about Jake's photograph, about the tiny target at an impossible distance, about the challenge of building something that could reach across nearly 4 kilometers with lethal precision. If we did this, she said slowly, I'd want complete control over the rifle design. No compromises based on what you think will work. Agreed. And I'd want to understand every aspect of the ballistics involved. Not just the calculations, but the practical applications. That's the only way it would work. Sarah took another deep breath, feeling as if she were about to jump from a great height with no guarantee that her parachute would open. Then, yes, she said. I'll do it. Jake's face broke into the first genuine smile she had seen from him. Excellent. When do we start? Now, Sarah said, surprising herself with her decisiveness. If we only have 4 months, we can't afford to waste any time. Jake nodded, suddenly, all business again. Right. First thing we need to do is run ballistics calculations for different calibers and bullet weights. Then, we need to design the action and barrel specifications. After that, we start thinking about ammunition development. Sarah felt a familiar thrill at the prospect of diving into such a complex project. But, underneath the excitement was a deeper emotion, something that felt suspiciously like hope. For the first time in years, she was embarking on something that would push her beyond the safe boundaries of her carefully controlled world. One more thing, Jake said as she began pulling ballistics references from the shelf behind the counter. This competition isn't just about shooting skills. The other participants will be some of the most experienced long-range shooters in the world, people who've been refining their craft for decades. Are you prepared for that level of pressure? Sarah paused, considering the question seriously. She had spent most of her adult life avoiding situations that might expose her to judgment or failure, building a life that was safe precisely because it was limited. But, looking at Jake now, seeing the confidence he had in her abilities, she felt something shift inside her chest. I don't know, she said honestly. But, I guess we're going to find out. Jake picked up one of the ballistics manuals, flipping through pages covered with trajectory tables and environmental coefficients. The first thing you need to understand about extreme long-range shooting, he said, is that it's less about marksmanship than it is about problem-solving. At 3,800 meters, you're not just aiming at a target. You're calculating solutions to a dozen different variables simultaneously. Sarah pulled out a notebook and began making lists of the factors they would need to consider: wind speed and direction at multiple altitudes, air density, temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, the rotation of the Earth, even the gravitational effects of the target's elevation relative to the shooting position. "This is going to be the most complex project I've ever attempted," she said, looking at the growing list. "That's what makes it worthwhile," Jake replied. "Anyone can build a rifle that shoots accurately at normal distances. What we're trying to do has only been accomplished by a handful of people in the world." As they worked through the initial calculations, Sarah found herself drawn into the challenge with an intensity that surprised her. Every variable they identified led to 3 more considerations, every solution created new problems to solve. It was exactly the kind of intellectual puzzle she had always loved, but magnified to a degree that made her previous work seem simple by comparison. Hours passed without either of them noticing. The shop's phone rang twice, but Sarah ignored it, completely absorbed in the complex mathematics of extreme ballistics. When she finally looked up, the afternoon sun was slanting through the windows, and Jake was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "Nothing," he said, but his smile suggested otherwise. "I was just thinking that Martinez trained you well. Most people would have given up by now." Sarah felt a warm glow of pride, followed immediately by the familiar anxiety that accompanied any personal compliment. She had learned not to trust praise, not to let herself become dependent on other people's approval. But something about Jake's matter-of-fact acknowledgement of her abilities felt different, more genuine than the casual flattery she was used to deflecting. "We should probably call it a day," she said, suddenly, aware that they had been working in close proximity for nearly 8 hours. "I need to process all of this before we go any further." Jake nodded, beginning to gather up the reference materials they had scattered across the counter. "Same time tomorrow?" "Same time tomorrow," Sarah agreed, then hesitated. "Jake? This competition you mentioned. What's the real story behind it?" Jake paused in his organizing, and for a moment Sarah thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual, carrying a weight that suggested painful memories. "The man who runs it is someone I served with overseas," he said. "Someone who saved my life more than once. He's been pushing the boundaries of extreme distance shooting for years, trying to prove that the limits most people accept are arbitrary. The competition is his way of advancing the science." "And you feel like you owe him?" Jake looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "I feel like I owe it to myself to find out how good I really am. And, after meeting you, I think we both owe it to ourselves to find out how good we can be together." Sarah felt her cheeks flush at the unintended intimacy of his words. Together suggested a partnership that went beyond the merely professional, and the possibility both excited and terrified her. "I'll see you tomorrow," she said, busying herself with locking up the cash register to avoid having to respond to the implications in his statement. After Jake left, Sarah stood alone in her shop, surrounded by the familiar tools and weapons that had been her constant companions for so many years. But everything felt different now, charged with new possibility and new risk. In agreeing to Jake's proposal, she had committed herself to a journey that would either prove her capabilities or expose the limits of her courage. As she climbed the stairs to her apartment that evening, Sarah Chen wondered if Martinez would have approved of the path she had chosen. She thought he would have, though he also would have warned her about the dangers of reaching too far beyond her grasp. But, as she sat down with her dinner and opened the first of many ballistics manuals she would need to master in the coming months, Sarah found that she didn't care about the risks. For the first time in years, she was truly excited about the future. And, tomorrow, the real work would begin. 3 weeks into their collaboration, Sarah's hands were stained with gun oil and metal shavings, her apartment had been transformed into a ballistics laboratory, and she hadn't slept more than 5 hours in any single night. The rifle was taking shape with agonizing precision, each component machined to tolerances that pushed the limits of her equipment and her skill. Jake had moved into a motel 6 blocks from the shop, but he spent every waking hour at her side, reviewing calculations, offering suggestions, and slowly revealing the depth of his expertise in ways that both impressed and intimidated her. He knew things about ballistics that weren't written in any manual, insights gained through years of making shots that others considered impossible. "The barrel needs to be longer," Sarah said, examining the steel tube she had been working on for the past 4 days. At 32 inches, it was already longer than anything she had ever built, but the ballistics calculations demanded more. "How much longer?" Jake asked, looking up from the trigonometry tables he had been studying. The motel room's small table was covered with his notes, calculations that tracked wind patterns and atmospheric conditions at the ranch where they would eventually test the rifle. 36 inches minimum, probably 38, Sarah said, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. The additional barrel length will give us another 100 feet per second of muzzle velocity, which translates to a flatter trajectory and better energy retention at extreme range. Jake nodded, making notes in the margin of his calculations. That's going to make the rifle heavy. Probably pushing 18 pounds with the scope and bipod. Heavy is stable, Sarah replied, echoing something Martinez had taught her years ago. And, at the distances we're shooting, stability matters more than convenience. She turned back to her lathe, adjusting the settings for another pass on the barrel's exterior. The work was hypnotic, the steady rhythm of cutting steel allowing her mind to process the hundreds of variables they were trying to optimize. Every fraction of an inch mattered, every surface finish affected accuracy in ways that were measurable but not always predictable. Sarah, Jake said, and something in his tone made her look up from the lathe. We need to talk about the ammunition. She shut off the machine, wiping her hands on a rag that had long since ceased to be clean. What about it? Jake held up a brass cartridge case, one of the 100 pieces they had ordered for load development. Factory ammunition won't cut it for what we're trying to do. The tolerances are too loose, the powder charge is too inconsistent. We need to load every round by hand. Sarah had suspected this was coming. Factory ammunition was manufactured to standards that were adequate for most shooting applications, but, at distances approaching 4 kilometers, tiny variations in powder weight or bullet seating depth would translate to misses measured in feet rather than inches. I've never loaded ammunition before, she admitted, another gap in her practical experience that felt increasingly significant as the scope of their project expanded. I'll teach you, Jake said simply. But, it's going to add another layer of complexity. We'll need to test dozens of different powder and bullet combinations, weigh every charge to the tenth of a grain, measure every cartridge case and sort them by internal volume. Sarah looked at the brass cartridge in Jake's hand, trying to imagine the precision required to handload ammunition for shots at such extreme distances. She was already working 12-hour days on the rifle itself, and the thought of adding ammunition development to her workload was overwhelming. How long will that take? She asked. If we work efficiently? 2 weeks to develop the load, another week to manufacture enough ammunition for practice and the competition. 3 more weeks. Sarah calculated quickly, realizing that their timeline was becoming impossibly tight. They still needed to finish the rifle, mount and zero the scope, and travel to the ranch for actual shooting practice. Most importantly, she still needed to learn how to shoot at distances she had never attempted. We're running out of time, she said, voicing the fear that had been growing in the back of her mind. Jake set down the brass cartridge and moved closer, studying her face with those disconcerting eyes. Are you having second thoughts? Sarah considered the question seriously. The project had consumed her life completely, turning her orderly existence into a chaos of technical challenges and looming deadlines. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and frequently doubted whether she had the skills necessary to succeed. But, underneath all of that was an excitement she had never experienced before, a sense of purpose that made the difficulties worthwhile. No, she said finally. But, I'm scared. Good, Jake said, surprising her. Fear keeps you focused. The moment you stop being scared is the moment you start making mistakes. Sarah resumed work on the barrel, using the familiar rhythm of the lathe to calm her nerves. Jake returned to his calculations, but she could feel his attention on her as she worked, a presence that had become both comforting and distracting over the past weeks. Jake, she said without looking up from the lathe, what happens if we fail? What happens if I can't make the shots when it matters? Jake was quiet for so long that she began to think he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a thoughtfulness that suggested he had been considering the same question. Then, we'll have learned something about our limits, he said. But, I don't think we're going to fail. How can you be so confident?